They placed the crown on a child's head, 8 years old, and I was expected to rule men older than my father. They thought they were raising a puppet, but I was learning. I listened when they lied. I remembered when they laughed. And one day, I became the one they feared most, a king who thinks for himself. They say I lost God's blessing. No, I just stopped begging for it. I didn't build France with prayers. I built it with reason. And even when I loved, I didn't fall. I remained a king. They placed the crown on my head, and I felt smaller than ever. I was 8 years old. My hands could not hold a sword, let alone a kingdom. Yet the lords bowed. The priests chanted. And the people, they cheered. Not for me, for the crown. My father, King Henry I, had died suddenly. They said it was his heart. I remembered his strength, his silence, and the way he once lifted me to his horse and called me his little lion. Now that lion was dead, and I was to wear his mane. They told me I was king. But in truth, I was a symbol, a boy wrapped in velvet, guarded by men with sharper smiles than swords. My mother, Queen Anne of Kiev, kissed my forehead at the coronation. Her lips trembled. She whispered in Greek, a prayer I didn't understand, but never forgot. My uncle Baldwin of Flanders stood behind me like a shadow. They said he would rule with me, but I knew the truth. I was king in name. Baldwin was king in fact. They called it a regency. I called it a cage. The court changed quickly. Servants who once ignored me now bowed too deeply. Courtiers offered me sweets and false laughter. I learned to smile when I wanted to run, to nod when I didn't understand. I learned to be quiet and watch. The older lords laughed at me behind goblets. Our little Capetian, they'd say, wears his father's boots, but not his step. They thought I didn't hear. I always heard. I was not stupid. I was not soft. I was 8. And I was listening. One night I crept into the old library. I wanted to find my father's letters, anything that might tell me how he ruled. Instead, I found dust and a drawing. Me, as a child, in his arms. On the back he had written, "Let him be strong enough to choose mercy." It was the only time I cried. Not because I was sad. Because he believed in me. Because he knew the weight I would carry. Because for a moment, I felt like a son, not a symbol. Baldwin ruled well, they said. He kept the peace. He negotiated with Normandy. He collected taxes and repaired bridges. But he rarely spoke to me. When he did, it was with instructions, not affection. You must watch them, he told me once. Smiles are daggers. Praise is poison. A king must be feared before he is loved. But I remembered my mother's words. To rule a heart is greater than to command a sword. I didn't know who to believe, so I believed both. One evening, I slipped from the palace with a servant boy, Alain. We ran to the village outside the gates. I wore a hood. No one knew me. There, I saw children chasing chickens, women singing while mending nets, and old men laughing over wine. No thrones, no titles, just life. A baker gave us warm bread. I had no coin. He smiled and said, "First one's always free. Come back when you're king." I laughed. And for a moment, I was not afraid. When I returned, Baldwin was furious. I was locked in my chambers for a week. He shouted that a king could not disappear, but I had seen something he hadn't. A kingdom that did not care for crowns. Only bread, warmth, and laughter. That night I wrote in my journal, "I am king, but I want to be more than their fear. I want to be their memory, their hope." A letter arrived from Normandy. Duke William demanded an audience. My advisors whispered of war. I was still only a boy, but I began to wonder, What if a child could be a king? Not despite his youth, but because of it. They smiled when they swore loyalty, and sharpened knives under the table. By the time I turned 13, Baldwin of Flanders began to loosen his grip, not because he trusted me, but because I had learned to wear the crown without asking how heavy it was. I sat in council now. I signed documents. I learned names, debts, grudges. I also learned fear. The barons, the dukes, the so-called loyal lords, they bowed lower when they planned rebellion. Some had grown rich while Baldwin ruled in my name. Now they saw a boy pretending to be king. And boys are easier to shape, or to break. I still remember the first rebellion. It began with a whisper. Count Theobald of Blois refused to pay his levy. Then came letters, alliances, promises traded in candlelight. They thought I would fold. Instead, I invited them to Paris. A feast, a celebration, my coming of age. They came in armor disguised as finery, swords hidden in their wagons, smiles on their lips. I matched every one. I had no army, no threat. But I had a plan. That night, I sat beside them, poured their wine, toasted their names. And when the hall roared with laughter, I stood. I know some of you doubt me, I said. I know some of you think I am still the boy with jam on his fingers. Silence. I am that boy. And he remembers everything. I gestured. Guards entered. Not royal knights, but peasants, townsmen, bakers, blacksmiths. Every man I had met when I walked among them as a child. Armed now, not to kill, but to stand. To show the lords that the crown had eyes in the streets, not just in palaces. No swords were drawn. But no one forgot that night. Afterward, Baldwin called me foolish. They will try again, he said. You won nothing but time. I disagreed. I had made them afraid, not of steel but of silence, of a boy who listened, who remembered. Around that time, I began keeping a secret book. I wrote everything: who lied, who smiled too much, who hesitated before pledging gold. I learned diplomacy not from treaties, but from watching how long a man would hold your gaze. I also began sending gifts to barons, wives, to their sons, horses, manuscripts, a carved chest set from Moorish Spain, not bribes, messages. I see you. I will be your son's king one day. Fear is powerful, but memory lasts longer. One night, my mother visited me. Anne of Kiev, once regal, now quiet, veiled. She brought me figs and kissed my hand. You are becoming like your father, she said. I asked, strong? She paused. No, silent. That stayed with me. The lords quieted for a time, not because they loved me, but because they didn't know what I would do next. I had learned the first law of kingship. Never show all your weapons, especially if you don't yet have them. News arrived from Flanders. Baldwin had died. My regent was gone, and I was alone, truly king for the first time. They expected me to fail the moment Baldwin died. A boy without a shield, a king without a kingmaker. But they forgot something. While Baldwin ruled, I watched. While they drank and hunted, I listened. I had spent my youth among wolves, and I had learned how to hunt. The kingdom I inherited was fragile. France, in truth, was a patchwork. Scraps of loyalty stitched together by fear, gold, or habit. The royal domain was thin, a spider's web stretched over arrogant dukes and jealous counts. So I began with something simple. Names. I summoned every lord I could to Paris. Not for war, not yet. For homage. I didn't threaten, I didn't beg. I greeted them with open hands, warm meals, and careful words. I am not here to take what is yours, I said, but I will remind you what is mine. Some laughed behind their sleeves. Others nodded, warily. But I saw the fear in their eyes. Not of me, but of what I might become. A king who didn't need to shout to be heard. Then I turned to the roads. No army can move through mud. No merchant sells without bridges. I repaired the Roman roads, taxed fairly, and protected trade routes. The people began to speak well of me. That was more valuable than 1,000 armored knights. My name, not my sword, traveled. Not all bowed easily. The Count of Vermandois refused to pay his debts. He claimed I had no right to collect them. I sent no army. I sent monks. They arrived with parchment and ink, and a copy of the old royal charters. By the time they finished reading, the Count paid twice over. It became a game. They played at rebellion. I played at memory. That winter, I visited a village struck by famine. I came without banners, only a small escort. I met a girl there, maybe 10, who offered me her only blanket. When I told her I was king, she laughed and said, "Kings don't wear patched boots." She was right, so I sent new boots. And grain. And I never forgot her name, Isabel. Years later, I knighted her son. In council, I spoke less and said more. I let older men argue, then asked a single question that silenced the room. I began to appoint lesser nobles, loyal ones to key positions, bypassing arrogant dynasties. Some called it favoritism. I called it strategy. I was building something, not just power, but belief. Then came the test, a rebellion in the south, not by nobles, but peasants, driven by hunger and anger. My advisors urged force. Crush them. Set an example. I rode south myself. No crown, no parade. I listened. They were starving, yes, but also abandoned, taxed by lords who hadn't set foot there in years. I executed one such lord publicly, redistributed his lands, and lowered grain taxes. The revolt ended not in blood, but in silence. Respectful silence. That was the day I first felt like a king. Not because I ruled. Because they believed I could. A messenger arrived from Holland. An offer of alliance. And of marriage. A crown was no longer enough. Now they wanted a queen. They called it a union of peace. I called it a crown in a bridal veil. Bertha of Holland arrived in a golden carriage, her hands folded in lace, her eyes unreadable. She was noble, well-bred, virtuous, and entirely unknown to me. The daughter of Count Florus, she was chosen by my council for her family's ships, her father's neutrality, and her womb. Not her heart, not mine. Our wedding was grand. Paris glowed for days. The cathedral thundered with chants and bells. I stood at the altar and promised to love, honor, and cherish, and I meant none of it, not out of cruelty, but out of honesty. I married a treaty, not a woman. She married a crown, not a man. Bertha was quiet, dignified, cold as glass. We shared a table, a bed, a realm, but not a life. She spoke of courtly duties, religious festivals, her lineage. She never asked me about mine. We had dinners that felt like treaties, nights that felt like silence. When she became pregnant, she told me in a whisper, eyes downcast. I nodded, kissed her hand, and walked away. Our son, Louis, was born on a stormy night. The windows rattled. The bells rang. I stood outside her chamber for hours, not pacing, frozen. When the nurse placed him in my arms, I did not smile. I held a future, a flame, a sword not yet forged. He opened his eyes, and I saw not myself but my father, and his father, and a crown that would one day rest on this boy's brow. Not love, not fear, legacy. Bertha wept in the night. I heard her. But I did not go to her. At court, she walked a step behind me, always gracious, always formal. But I saw how the ladies whispered, how she watched me from behind veils. She knew I did not love her. Perhaps she never loved me. But there was a kind of pain, worse than betrayal. Indifference. Still, she gave me a son. She fulfilled her role. And I ruled. I pushed reforms, broke up noble monopolies, strengthened trade. I hosted ambassadors, held court over feuds, issued new charters for towns. My realm grew more stable, more respected. But my heart shrank in its golden cage. I was not a man anymore, I was a machine. Then one evening, as I walked through the palace gardens, I passed a young maid reading by torchlight. She looked up, startled. Dropped her book. It was poetry. She blushed, apologized. I smiled, a real smile, for the first time in months. We talked, for an hour, not about treaties, about dreams. She was nobody, but for that hour, I remembered I was human. I never saw her again, but I began to understand the hunger growing in me, not for power, for connection. A letter arrived from Anjou. Count Folc sought alliance, and he would bring his wife. Her name was Bertrade, and everything began to change. I did not know I was starving until I tasted her voice. So today we dive into the rise of Philip I, who lived as he wanted and still made France stronger. But before we go on, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more cinematic stories of love, power, and real history. After that, leave a comment and let us know. When do you stop being yourself? If you stay silent, or when you give up? All right, ready to meet the king who did not become a puppet? Bertrade de Montfort arrived with Count Folc of Anjou, her husband. She wore no jewels, only a veil of grace and defiance. Her eyes, dark and steady, met mine not with reverence, but recognition. She saw through me, past the crown, past the mask. And for the first time in years, I felt seen. Folc was everything I despised. Brutish, arrogant, eager to boast of his battles and conquests. He showed off Bertrade like a prize, then ignored her like a servant. I watched her smile through gritted teeth, bow through disdain, endure his hand on her shoulder like a chain. I was king, but she was captive, and I envied her less than I pitied her. One afternoon we walked alone in the rose garden, a chance meeting, or so the servants thought. She quoted a line of Latin poetry I had read as a boy. I answered. We smiled. It began. Words turned to glances, glances to touches, touches to silence. She didn't seduce me. She awakened me. I told myself it was madness, that kings don't fall in love with other men's wives, that I had a son, a wife, a country. That I had already defied too many lines between crown and heart, duty and desire. But I kept finding reasons to see her, to hear her, to breathe when I was near her. And then I stopped lying. To myself. To her. I told Bertrade I loved her. She didn't flinch. I know, she said. And in that moment I knew I was already lost. We were discreet. At first. But Paris breathes gossip like air. Bertha grew silent, cold. Louis stared at me like I was a stranger. Bishops murmured. Barons frowned. But I no longer cared. I had tasted something more intoxicating than power, freedom. When I invited Bertrade to remain in Paris, Folc protested. I ignored him. When I gave her chambers near mine, the court gasped. I did not blink. When I kissed her hand in public, the church wrote its first warning. I tore it in half. It was more than love, it was rebellion. Against the role I had been forced to play, against the silence I had learned to master. With Bertrade, I was not king, not ruler, not symbol. I was man. I was breath. I was fire. One night she asked, "Would you give up the crown?" I answered, "No, but I would burn for you." She kissed me like it was a vow. The Pope's messenger arrived, a parchment sealed in red. Excommunication. The gates of heaven had closed, and I had never felt more alive. They said I had lost God, but I had never felt closer to being human. The parchment arrived like a curse, sealed in red wax, written in perfect Latin. Pope Urban II declared me excommunicated, cast out of the church, denied the sacraments, damned in life and death, because I would not leave Bertrade, because I would not lie. The court froze. Priests refused to offer mass in my presence. Some bishops fled Paris. My nobles whispered in panic. A king outside the grace of God was a king without divine right. Bertha's family petitioned Rome to restore her. Louis stopped speaking to me. My mother sent a letter with only one line. Do not trade eternity for a kiss. But I would not repent. Not then, because I had tasted truth. Not doctrine, but desire. Not ritual, but soul. With Bertrade, I remembered who I was before the crown. A boy. A man. A voice not yet muffled by robes and gold. She gave me no heirs. No alliance. No safe legacy. She gave me myself. We lived in a kind of shadow court. Banished from altars. Ignored by Rome. But Paris remained loyal. The markets bustled. The roads held. The people did not rise up against me. Perhaps they saw that a king in love was still a king. I still ruled. I passed laws. Resolved disputes. I negotiated with England and kept Normandy at bay. My hands signed decrees with the same steady ink. But inside, I burned. Some nights, I knelt alone in my chapel. I stared at the crucifix and whispered, "Did I choose wrong, or did you make me wrong?" No answer came, only silence. Bertrade never asked me to change. She knew the weight I carried. She carried it with me. Mocked, scorned, painted as a temptress. But she stood tall, proud, fierce. When they called her whore, she smiled. When they threatened her, she replied, "I fear no man who cannot love as deeply as he hates." I remember a moment. Late summer, rain falling through the palace eaves. She stood by the window, watching the storm. "I'll leave if you ask," she said. My voice cracked. "Don't." That was the first time I wept in front of her. I had lost God's blessing. But I had found something sacred in her gaze. A quiet knowing, a shared exile. Rumors came from Rome. A crusade was being prepared. A holy war for Jerusalem. And I, the damned king, would not be invited. A king without God. A lover without a future. A father without a son. I ruled, but from the margins. Years passed in this twilight. The church had not lifted my excommunication. I was not just disobedient, I was damned. And yet, I still wore the crown. The people still paid their taxes. The roads stayed safe. The granaries filled. Merchants praised me. Towns petitioned for royal charters. They needed a king who ruled, not knelt. So I ruled. But I was never invited to the great councils. I was not blessed when children were born. I was not named when crusaders gathered their banners. France marched to the Holy Land without its king. I sent grain, I sent silver, I sent prayers. But I remained behind, as if God had drawn a circle and I stood just outside it. Bertrade grew quieter, older. Her fire turned to ash. Not gone, but banked. We still laughed, we still touched. But something had changed. She no longer dreamed of being queen. She dreamed of peace. One day she said, "They will never forgive you." I nodded. "I know." "Then, you must forgive yourself." I didn't answer. Because I couldn't. Louis grew taller, colder. My son studied with priests, fasted, prayed. He saw me as the cautionary tale, the king who traded heaven for flesh. He would not speak of Bertrade. He barely spoke to me. Once, we argued over a charter. He said it violated church property. I said, "The church violated me first." He looked at me with something worse than anger. Disappointment. I began to feel it, in my bones, my breath, the weight of years. Not age, exile, a crown that no longer sat proud, but heavy. My enemies waited for weakness, but they never came close. Because I did not collapse. I adapted. I made peace with old rivals. Knighted new vassals. Married off my daughter to a Lombard prince. I even mediated a dispute between two bishops, though one refused to look me in the eye. That was the new game. I ruled a kingdom that relied on me, but prayed I would disappear. Sometimes, late at night, I would walk alone through the cloisters. The stone was cold. the air sharp. I would whisper aloud, "If I am damned, why is France at peace?" And no voice ever answered. In 1104, a new envoy arrived from Rome. He brought parchment, olive branches, and terms. Redemption had a price, and I knew what it would cost. The parchment was soft, the ink still wet. Rome had spoken, not with thunder, but with terms. I could be forgiven if I gave up Bertrade. 12 years of exile, 12 years of defiance. Now, with one signature, I could reclaim the church, the crown, the sacred rights. But I would have to send her away, I told Bertrade first. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply nodded. I always knew this day would come. I fell to my knees. "Forgive me," I said. "I already did," she replied. I arranged for her to live in a priory. Safe, comfortable, quiet. She left at dawn, veiled in gray. No procession. No goodbye. I watched from the tower, and when the gate closed behind her, I felt the world tilt. She had made me human. Now, I was king again. Rome lifted the sentence. Masses resumed. Clergy returned. I was blessed publicly by the Archbishop of Lyon. They called it reconciliation. It felt like funeral rites. Louis was pleased. He told me he admired my penance. Penance? I had not repented. I had surrendered. We stood together in court. Father and son. Two kings, one of earth, one of heaven. He had grown tall, devout, pure, everything the church wanted, and nothing I understood. He questioned my edicts, softly, politely, but constantly. He rewrote my tax reforms. He softened penalties I had hardened. He said, "Justice without mercy is tyranny." I replied, "Mercy without order is chaos." He smiled. But he did not agree. The nobles began to drift toward him. He was the future. And I was a reminder of scandal, of shadow, of sin. One day I found him praying alone. I watched in silence. He looked up and said, "Will they remember you for your reforms or your rebellion?" I said nothing, because I didn't know. But I saw something in him. Conviction, faith, purpose. He would be a better man than me. But I wasn't sure he would be a better king. France is not ruled by prayer alone. It is ruled by memory, by fear, by strength. Louis had yet to learn that. My body began to fail. My hands trembled. My breath grew shallow. Time was closing in. And there was still one more thing I had to do. They forgave me, but I never felt clean. After Bertrade left, I fulfilled every condition Rome had laid out. Public penance, alms to the poor, a grand mass where I walked barefoot to the altar, my head bare, my back bent. The people cheered. The priests wept. The Pope sent his blessing. And still, I felt hollow. The crown felt heavier now, not from gold, but from time. I had ruled for decades. I had survived rebellions, exile, scandals, crusades. And now I stood in the sunlight, unchained. But the warmth didn't reach my bones. I walked more slowly, ate less, slept poorly. I took no lovers, laughed less. Bertrade's name was never spoken at court again. But she lived inside my silence. Louis sat beside me more often now. He was more confident, more decisive. He passed reforms without my approval, issued decrees in my name. I let him. Because I was tired, because I was curious. What would my son make of the world I built? Sometimes we disagreed. He argued for full pardons for rebellious vassals. I warned him they would return with daggers. He praised the church in every speech. I reminded him "The same church once damned your father." He answered, "Because my father gave them reason." There was no malice in his voice, only judgment, and it cut deeper than any sword. I visited Bertha's grave once. It was quiet. Wildflowers grew along the stone. I stood for a long time, wondering if she had ever truly hated me. I whispered, "I'm sorry." No voice answered. Just wind. France was at peace. The roads were safe. The fields full. The nobles mostly loyal. The church reconciled. And still, I could not sleep. They said I had been redeemed. But I knew the truth. Redemption is a ledger. It balances sin against silence. And my silence was vast. I could feel it now. The end. And I had one final thing to say. Not as a king, but as a man. By the end, I had no one beside me. Not Bertha, whom I cast aside for a crown I thought too cold. Not Bertrade, whom I loved enough to defy the Pope, and not enough to keep when the church demanded peace. Not Louis, my son, who stood close in duty but far in soul. And not the church, who forgave me but never embraced me. I had France. And I had silence. They say I ruled longer than any king before me, that I brought order, peace, dignity to a throne once mocked by its own barons. They say I punished greedy lords, built roads, protected the markets, fed the hungry, and kept the kingdom from breaking apart while the world around me crusaded and burned. They are right. I did all that. And I did it while excommunicated, while damned. But no one rules without cost. I remember Bertha, not as my queen, but as the woman I married for France. She gave me a son. She gave me loyalty. I gave her public humiliation. My sin was not loving another. My sin was never seeing her pain until it was too late to matter. I remember Bertrade, her fire, her defiance, her voice in the night whispering that we were more than titles. I stood by her as long as I could. I challenged Rome. I ignored the Pope. I let France walk with a shadow across its soul. But when the kingdom itself began to strain, when the threat of spiritual collapse crept into every church and court, I gave her up, not with cruelty, but I still let her go. And that is a wound I carry deeper than any crown. She lived out her days in a priory, safe, serene, and forgotten. I visited her once. She smiled, but there was distance in her eyes. Not hate, not grief, just resignation. We had fought so hard to be together. And in the end, I chose something else. My grandfather, Robert, did the same. He loved Bertha of Burgundy, and when Rome said no, he let her go. They called him holy. They called me damned. But he locked his love in a tower and lived with the title pious. I stood in open defiance, and lost the woman I loved all the same. Perhaps neither of us won. Louis stood at my deathbed. He did not scold. He did not smile. He simply watched. He had become the king the church always wanted. Pure, clean, obedient. They would praise him. They would bless him. He would be everything I was not. And maybe that is good. Because I was not a saint. I was not a martyr. I was a man. A king. A husband who failed. A lover who faltered. A ruler who chose not what was right, but what was real. In the end, I wrote no last decree, no long testament, just this. I chose love. I chose it when it hurt. I chose it when it ruined me. I chose it even when I walked away, because I knew what it had meant, and I hoped that someone would remember not just the sinner, not just the king, but the man who had dared to want more than power. They buried me at Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire. There were bells, there were bishops, there was Louis, but no Bertha, no Bertrade, just the crown, and the silence I left behind. Thank you for listening. So, what do you think? Is living the way you want a guarantee of getting what you want? Drop your take in the comments. And while you're here, check out more stories from the dynasty.